One of my favorite aspects of film history are deleted scenes, especially those from iconic older films. There's just something almost mythical about a movie that's so beloved by many, yet has so much unseen cut footage. So I thought it was about time for another deep dive into iconic films with lost and locked away scenes, but this time focus on two specific film franchises, Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Because despite their overwhelming popularity, there's a surprising amount that all these years later still haven't seen the light of day, and maybe never will. When it comes to the lost and deleted scenes of Star Wars, there's a lot to unpack, so let's start at the very beginning.
It's working!
No, I meant at the beginning of the original trilogy.
The rebellion?
Quiet down. You got a mouth bigger than me,
I'm quiet. Listen how quiet I am. You can barely hear me.
Other than being the obvious place to start, A New Hope stands out among the others as the only one to have an actual alternate edit of the movie, dubbed as the Lost Cut. For a little backstory, a man by the name of John Gibson was hired as the initial editor of the Star Wars, who had also worked on films such as A Hard Day's Night. By the third day of shooting in March of 1975, the editor was continually sent daily rushes to begin putting together a rough cut of the film.
Look, we're gonna need it.
However, when George Lucas saw the first assembly of the film that spring, he was far from happy with what he saw, later calling it quote-unquote unwatchable. Evidently, Lucas felt Gibson was making each scene way too long and cutting it too traditionally, and overall was lacking the excitement, pace, and rhythm a film like Star Wars desperately needed. So when Gibson refused to cut the film Lucas's way, he was fired off the film, with less than 1 month left of principal photography, and editing began from scratch.
And you call yourselves human?
You are far too trusting.
However, this first rough cut wasn't destroyed, but locked away in the Lucasfilm archives, where it remains to this day. Specific information about this black and white cut of the Star Wars has become a legend of its own, a holy grail of sorts that incites plenty of debate and speculation. Only a handful of people have actually seen it, with one of those being Dr. David West Reynolds, who wrote an article about it in the late 90s. Over the years, quite a bit of footage has been released of what's believed to have been part of this lost cut, which, keep in mind, was technically a rough assembly missing all the special effects and a handful of entire scenes. Some even found its way into the infamous Star Wars holiday special, such as the Life on Tatooine segment and a redubbed scene with Darth Vader.
It's just a matter of time before we find the rebels.
It's just a matter of time before we find the droids.
But of what hasn't been released, I feel it's important to stress that much of it is more than likely alternate line deliveries of the same scene.
Boy, where did you dig up that old fossil?
Where did you dig up that old fossil?
You know, I did feel something. I could almost see the remote.
That's good.
You know, I did feel something. I could almost see the remote.
That's good.
Alternate dialogue.
But they're gonna kill her! Better her than me! No. I've seen her. She's so beautiful.
But they're gonna kill her! Better her than me.
And slight scene extensions.
You must do what you feel is right, of course.
Right now, I don't feel too good.
However, that being said, there's still plenty of fascinating scenes that still haven't seen the light of day, such as additional sequences featuring rear projection effects, which had been done as an attempt to cut cost and time, but were ultimately replaced with blue screen for the final film. There was also a different establishing shot of Obi-Wan's home, and a moving sequence in which Luke decides against restoring C-3PO's restraining bolt. And while possibly just a publicity photo, there's some evidence of an alternate battle between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader using the original design of the lightsabers. Now, to be honest, there's probably a lot more, but without further context, it's hard to tell which are simply promotional stills versus actual shot footage. In the meantime, I highly recommend checking out the video by FilmSpaced, Star Wars The Lost Cut Explained, as until it's hopefully one day released, it's probably the closest thing you're gonna get. But now it's time to move on to The Empire Strikes Back.
Wampa! Wampa!
New Tauntaun, Wampa, and action figures, each sold separately.
Han Solo! Help! Oh no! It's got Luke! Wampa! You'll be okay, Luke, as soon as I chase away that thing. Wampa! Wampa!
New Tauntaun and Hoth Wampa and other action figures, each sold separately from Kenner Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back collection.
Wampa!
Similar to A New Hope, over the years quite a bit of cut footage from The Empire Strikes Back has found its way to the public, such as another almost awkward kiss of a brother and sister, more of Luke in the bacta tank, and Leia working on Luke's hand. However, there's still quite a bit that is yet to see the light of day.
You smell something?
In the original version of Empire, we saw very little of the Wampa creature, mainly just the face and a few side glimpses, and of course his dismembered arm. However, this wasn't done by choice, but because the Wampa suit gave the filmmakers a lot of problems, so virtually all full body shots were cut from the final film, although an alternate view did show up very briefly in a TV spot. A few other very brief glimpses can also be seen in J.W. Rinzler's Making of Star Wars ebook, all of which I highly recommend.
Back is growing real well. Scars ought to be gone in a day or so.
As part of Luke's recovery, he was to receive a Bacta face mask, but while plenty of photographs have surfaced, the footage remains unseen. There's also the Wampa's attack on the base, which for as much that has been released of the abandoned subplot, there's still a lot we haven't seen. There's the footage of the Wampa attacking the rebels, and exactly how they finally contained the creature, which led to a gag involving the Empire that we have seen. One of the Wampas was even shot by a rebel with a bazooka, but only the aftermath has surfaced on film.
Picked up something outside the base of Zone 12 moving east.
It's metal.
Then it couldn't be one of those creatures.
There were even plans to have Luke fire upon even more Wampas, but there's debate as to whether this was actually filmed or abandoned after the publicity photos. Han Solo's torture scene was also far more horrifying, but the filmmakers felt it would be far too intense for children, so it was trimmed down dramatically. We also know that Luke originally had quite a few more training sequences with Yoda on Dagobah, although there is some debate as to how many were actually shot. Some of them may have just been partially filmed before they were abandoned midway through production. One example is a metal bar that Yoda throws into the air, which Luke has to then cut into tiny pieces, but the sequence was never finished.
Do or do not.
One of the more interesting lost scenes, or part of a scene, was Vader using the Force when Luke falls off the gantry. Maybe. You see, when Luke makes the plunge, originally he was to actually rise back up and over Darth Vader before falling back down, which was filmed. However, according to the original novel, this upwards draft was actually caused by Vader using the Force. There's a brief shot in the trailer that possibly, and I stress possibly, supports this, but for now how this appeared or what the true intentions were is a bit of a mystery. Finally, after Luke's encounter with Vader, his rescue was to also be lengthier, with Lando going to the top of the Millennium Falcon to physically rescue him. But now let's move on to Jedi.
I've orders to take you to Sarlacc pit, Luke Skywalker. Obey and you'll pay, Klaatu.
New Klaatu Skiff Guard Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian, each sold separately from Star Wars Revenge of the Jedi collection.
Now it seems like the Return of the Jedi has either made most of its cut footage public over the years, or didn't have all that much to begin with, but there are a few exceptions. There's the mysterious creature that was to be featured in Jabba's palace, jokingly referred to as Lightbulb Man, but since the ILM effects were never completed, what was envisioned for this creature is unknown. There was also a cut sequence in which C-3PO has to translate a conversation between two alien creatures, which ends up with him being knocked over. Though hardly a deleted scene, evidently Leia attacked a skiff guard with a vibro-axe, which in the final film cuts away literally moments before this encounter. However, one of the most interesting omissions answers a burning question from all the way back to A New Hope. Why didn't Obi-Wan tell Luke about his father? But thanks to Charlie Owen of the Return of the Jedi Edit Droid Facebook group, a laserdisc with over 30 minutes of raw footage that was thought to be lost was rediscovered, and within this footage was a pretty fascinating revelation.
Unfortunate that you rushed to face him. That incomplete was your training. That not ready for the burden were you. Obi-Wan would have told you long ago, had I let him.
But now it's time to move on to a new franchise altogether, Indiana Jones.
Hello.
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 How are you?
I'm fine, how are you? I'm smart?
Yeah,
Thank you. Whee!
The Indiana Jones franchise is, in my opinion, one of the best trilogies of all time. Okay, trilogy and one very mediocre sequel.
Knowledge was their treasure.
But all three original films have a surprising amount of key scenes that were left on the cutting room floor. So let's begin with Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Look, I did what I did. I don't expect you to be happy about it. But maybe it can do us both some good.
Now what's very curious about the Indiana Jones films, including Raiders, is that not a single deleted scene has ever been released on its own. Instead, many have appeared as little snippets within documentaries, but they give an idea of how the scene would have played out in full. One example are pieces of the original Cairo sword fight, which was planned to be far more elaborate and intricately choreographed. There was also to be a much longer sequence of Belloq's ceremony leading up to the opening of the Ark of the Covenant. Another partial scene answered the long-held mystery of how the heck Indy survived on top of that submarine, but there's still quite a bit that haven't surfaced, at least in the form of footage, such as the continuation of this sequence in which Indy is pursued by a group of sharks. Also cut from the film was Indy being told specifically about the dangers of the Ark, which explains how he knew to use those wooden poles and avoid looking at it once it was opened, although one behind-the-scenes photo does seem to contradict this, so maybe one variation had Sala telling Indy instead.
Marion, don't look at it. Shut your eyes, Marion, don't look at it no matter what happens.
There's also a cut sequence in which Sala is nearly executed. This was to have taken place either after the incident at the camp or after the Well of Souls. Either way, a young soldier is given the task of executing Sala, but he struggles with carrying out his orders by killing what appears to be a harmless stranger. Ultimately, he's unable to go through with it, but the scene was said to have been incredibly emotional, but unfortunately cut due to its length.
The problem with a movie like this when you don't really know what the effects are going to be until you get into post-production. It's very hard to direct somebody and say, look frightened or look overjoyed or look with awe at something that will not be in for 4 months.
But perhaps the most infamous so-called lost scene of Raiders is the original version of Belloc's head explosion. The scene as initially filmed was considered far too graphic to earn a PG rating, as keep in mind there was no PG-13 back then, so flames were superimposed to lessen its gratuitous impact. Interestingly, Colonel Dietrich's head implosion was also to be far more graphic, as his skin was to crack and peel away before winding up as a deformed, shriveled head. However, this never went beyond the initial test, as again, they wanted to avoid receiving an R rating. However, speaking of an almost R rating, let's move on to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. But first, let's lighten the mood with some bloopers from raw footage I acquired many years ago.
Wearing your beds?
You're just too proud to admit that you're crazy.
You want me Louis? Why the f would I say Louis?
Okay. Whoa. Sorry.
Now, unlike Raiders, only a few tiny snippets of the film's many deleted scenes have surfaced in the form of footage, one of which explains how Willie was captured as she tries to receive help from Shatter Lal. It was cut more than likely due to pacing, but the comic book adaptation fills in the blanks. However, the vast majority of the film's deleted scenes still remain completely locked away. One of the earliest examples is aboard Lao She's plane, as his hired goons argue back and forth over which of them should kill Indy, Willie, and Short Round, and by what means. Ultimately, of course, they decide to just empty the plane's fuel and parachute to safety. There was also evidently quite a bit more of the group at Pankot Palace, as well as the gross-out dinner scene. Judging off some of my footage, the bedroom sequence would have also been extended a little bit longer. One from later in the film is a bit puzzling as to why it was cut, as it explains how Short Round knew that fire would awaken Indy from his trance. While Short Round is working in the mines, he accidentally slices a wall which shoots out lava, which catches the leg of one of the possessed thuggies on fire. He goes to help and discovers the fire actually awoke him from his trance, and uses that same knowledge to help Indy later.
I'm alright, kid.
There was also a pretty major action sequence that was ultimately left on the cutting room floor, which explains Indy's seemingly out-of-place reaction and what really happened to Shatter Lal. After freeing Willie, Shatter Lal gets back up and lunges at Indy, and they tumble onto the cage over the giant lava pit. As the frame begins to fall, Indy's able to escape his grasp and jump to safety. The cage tumbles down into the lava and the villain bursts into flames, which honestly would have been pretty darn satisfying. Another scene I really wish they'd kept in the movie showed exactly how those kids escaped the Temple of Doom. Evidently, Indy creates a makeshift bridge over the giant lava pit, and one by one sends the kids on their way to freedom. However, once it's their turn to cross, the board catches on fire, and Short Round nearly falls to his doom, which explains why they escaped through the dangerous mine caverns instead. But now it's time to move on to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
That should do it.
Last but not least, we have the final installment of the Indiana Jones franchise. Okay, the final installment of the original trilogy, but The Last Crusade stands out among the other two as having by far the most amount of deleted scenes that have never seen the light of day. Beginning with the prologue, there was an alternate version of the Rhino sequence, in which the horn literally saves Indy from being stabbed. In the final version of the film, we only see the hands of Indy's father, but another variation of the scene would have showed Henry Jones as played by Alex Hyde White.
I trust your trip down was comfortable, Dr. Jones. My men didn't alarm you, I hope.
The scene in which Indiana Jones is approached by Donovan's men was initially much more sinister, as according to an early script and comic book adaptation, he doesn't go by his own free will. Backing this up are a few additional photos of Indy arriving to the penthouse, which is absent from the final film. The flight to Venice was also quite a bit more extensive, as Indy would have discovered a charcoal rubbing and sketch of Roman numerals in his father's diary. Some of this footage was used in the traveling map sequence, but as initially envisioned, it would have cleverly set up the sequence in the library, as well as finishing the charcoal rubbing in the tomb soon after.
And if you are a Scottish lord, then I am Mickey Mouse!
A pretty big chunk was also cut from the Brunwald Castle scene, as after punching out the butler, they hide the body in a sarcophagus. The joke was that the butler's face and sarcophagus are almost identical, which is a bit too on the nose for my taste. Elsa then waits around as Indy changes back into his clothes, which is where the film eventually picks up.
Egyptian Mail, morning edition, run! Did you say,
The encounter between Sala, Marcus, and the henchmen also had a gag that was cut, in which Sala slaps a camel, who then proceeds to spit up on the bad guys. This can also be seen in the comic book adaptation, and while I love the comedy in The Last Crusade, I think this would have taken things a bit too far. Once Indy and his father arrive at the airport, supposedly there was to be a bit of a cat-and-mouse game, as Indy and his father have to avoid detection by the Nazis. This is why they ultimately wind up on the Zeppelin, as it was the only Q that wasn't on patrol. But this scene also set up a major subplot that was completely removed: the Flying Ace and the Gestapos.
No ticket.
The setup begins as seen in the film, with the two Gestapos boarding the Zeppelin. Of course, one of them is tossed out of the window, but moments later, Indy was to have a fight with the other, knock him unconscious, and stuff him in a broom closet. As far as the Flying Ace, you can spot him in the background in a handful of shots, but originally the film would have cut to him drunkenly rambling about his war stories to nearby passengers. If you've always wondered why the Zeppelin turned back to Germany, it seems the second Gestapo awakens and alerts the pilot. As seen in the film, Indy and his father then race for one of the spare planes, but back on board, the Gestapo alerts the passengers and calls on the Flying Ace to help. The Flying Ace and Gestapo chase after Indy and his father down the framework of the Zeppelin. They eventually climb aboard the second spare plane, with the Gestapo behind the weaponry and Flying Ace at the controls. Unfortunately, in his drunken state, the Flying Ace forgets to start the engine before detaching, and they both crash down to Earth as the fighter pilots enter the chase.
John, I'm sorry! They got us!
A scene was also filmed showing Indy and his father arrive at Eskedron to meet up with Sala, and while not necessary to the plot, it would have been nice to see this initial reunion since Raiders. They also cut the shooting of Kasim by Donovan, instead opting to pick up immediately after. Now let's be honest, so far there's a lot of scenes you probably felt should have been left in, but there's one that in my opinion would have ruined one of the movie's best moments. As initially envisioned, we would have actually seen Indy hanging on some vines after the tank falls over the cliff, undermining the both heartfelt and comedic surprise after he reappears, although it's pretty obvious Henry's heartwarming speech was a pickup.
You know something, Dr. Jones? You're absolutely right.
Oof, that gets me every time. Near the end of the film, while it's certainly implied, another scene would have showed Indy's father passing him the Grail diary to begin the set of challenges. However, by far one of the most interesting lost scenes of The Last Crusade involves the second Grail challenge. As originally filmed, while it doesn't make the most logical sense, tarantulas were the consequences of failing the task, so when Indy stepped on the wrong letter, one would have crawled up his body. However, supposedly in post-production, Steven Spielberg rightly felt that compared to decapitation and falling to your death, this lacked any real impact. So right after Indy steps on the wrong letter, a new shot was inserted, but a close eye reveals that Indy's actual fall and getting back up were taken from the original Spider version. Finally, it wasn't Indy who was to give Elsa another warning about passing beyond the seal, but the knight himself. Evidently, there was a somewhat lengthy exchange which was cut out in post, and fixed by simply adding dialogue from Indy to Elsa off-screen.
Elsa, don't cross the seal! The knight warned us not to take the Grail from here!
However, you can still see the knight in several shots in the finished film, which explains why he randomly appears near the end. However, speaking of the Holy Grail Knight, if he were alive today and not stuck in a temple, there's no doubt in my mind he'd also love using honey.
You have chosen wisely.
Jokes aside, if you're not using honey, you are quite literally losing free money. It installs as an extension of your web browser in just 2 easy clicks. Then, after you're done shopping as usual on one of over 30,000 participating online stores, simply go to the checkout where a little box drops down, and with just 1 click, Honey will search all over the web for instant coupons to save off your purchase. If for some reason there aren't any coupons available, such as in my case when purchasing an Indiana Jones history book, you can at least rest assured that you're getting the absolute best price. Honey is completely free and doesn't even require your credit card information. Just install and start saving. So go to joinhoney.com/yesterworld or click on the link in the description to join Honey today. You'll be supporting the channel and saving money at the same time, so it really is a win-win for us both.